naryamaga ngo nsinzire nararaga ndira mukageza mu gitondo ariko mu gitondo nkiyumanganya.
In a world stained by tears and pain, her shattered spirit sought refuge in the depths of despair and found nothing. Each tear flowing down her cheek carries the weight of 1,000 heartbreaks, a vivid reflection of the misery she had endured.
Bibaye ngombwa ko mbisohora cyane ngo nigere n'ubuzima bwanjye. Ko n'ibintu na muganga umvura yansabye. Ko nasohora bigasohoka nkaruhuka.
Niragire Genevieve had mostly lived a solo adult life, and it was the time of her marriage that she thought to be the beginning of her paradise. That day, she wiped the tears of joy cascading down on her cheek, unbeknownst to her that a few years later she would be wiping the same tears again, but this time from the agony and betrayal instead of love and comfort. She's a woman who had bared the unbearable after her beloved husband cheated her with her best and sole friend, who also happened to be her preacher. Ever since then, her tears have never dried from her cheek, and she's yet to be sure if her pain will ever come to end. Why did this woman's husband and best friend cheat her, and how did she react? This is her tragic story. Genevieve had a good family she was proud of. Her husband was a loving and a caring man who provided everything his family needed. We never had any problem together. He was a man who loved us. He liked his kids and he provided whatever we wanted. I never had any problem with him. It was all good, and Genevieve's life was energized by a couple of friends she made. Among them was a preacher who later came to be her best friend. But this female preacher had other needs from Genevieve's family, which she later came to learn the hard way. When I got my first child, that's when my troubles started. We had a so-called Christian friend, and one day she proposed that I should join her church. She would preach to me and show me that she cared about my life. But behind the scenes, she had a secret mission with my husband, which I didn't know by then. Slowly but surely, the preacher started to earn the heart of Genevieve's husband, which she achieved. Genevieve started to doubt their relationship but had nothing to prove her doubts. Even when her husband's friend informed her that he was in a relationship with the preacher, Genevieve didn't want to believe it. I had a constant confusion because of the relationship, but things started to get tricky when my husband would go to work and never come back to sleep home. I started to ask him where he spent his nights, and he would reply that he was working during the night. He was working in the transportation industry, and it made sense, so I would happily accept his excuses. But one day, his friend and business partner came to see him at our house, and I asked him if they were together. He surprisingly answered that he had not seen him for a while. I got worried, thinking that he might have been kidnapped. When his friend saw that I was worried, he decided to tell me the truth, and he informed me that my husband is having an affair with our preacher. I bombarded him, but he insisted, telling me that it was something my husband had discussed with him. I was truly shocked, but I decided to look for evidence on my own since I had a clue of what was happening. Genevieve's house was closer to the house of the preacher, thus Genevieve's husband simply made a little journey to cheat on her next door. Thus, it was easier for her to investigate the matter. In the meantime, she decided to play cool and keep the relationship in positive state. One day, her husband told her about the trip he would make in the far village to remember one of his family members who had died. It was a good time to test him, and Genevieve went to the preacher's house where she would clearly see her husband entering the house. They had a family member who had died, and they would gather together to remember him. I used this opportunity to track him, and I saw him with my eyes when he went to the preacher's house and they closed the door. He never came back home that night, but when he came the next day, he told me that he had spent the night with his family members remembering one of the relatives who had died.
mbere yuko ibyo byose bitangira kubaho mwari mubanye gute n'umugabo wawe se mwari mubanye neza cyangwa wenda habagamo ibibazo runaka?
Nta kibazo twari dufitanye, yari umugabo ukunda urugo rwe.
It was a heartbreak when Genevieve saw firsthand the relationship between her husband and her best friend. But for the benefit of her children, she decided to stay with him, though she could not manage to sleep well during the nights. On the other hand, she kept her friendship with the preacher on good terms, avoiding anything that could irritate her husband.
Ntabwo yigeze acika kugenda mu rugo.
She never stopped coming to our house, and I never stopped to welcome her. I tried to live through that life because I had no other option, since I had neither a big family nor friends. So I chose to persevere. But the whole situation was putting a huge toll on me. There was no way I could have slept at night knowing that my husband was sleeping in the neighboring house, where I could hear his voice. I would spend my nights crying, but in the morning I tried my best to paint a good picture to both my children and my maid. Nobody would know that my night was full of tears. The news was spreading rapidly in the neighborhood, and everybody knew that Genevieve's husband was sleeping with the preacher. This prompted her church authorities to relieve her of her responsibilities. On the other hand, Genevieve's neighbors were asking her to divorce her cheating husband, though she refused. But all that meant nothing to Genevieve's husband, who continuously slept with the preacher to the point he would visit her every night and stay there for days. At the same time, he started to run to Genevieve whenever he tried to ask what was going on between them. When I asked him where he was going, he would rant at me and ask me whether I was supposed to know where he was going. He would ask me, "Am I carrying your child? Did I not provide food for you? Did I not pay rent? Why do you ask me where I'm going? Do you want to accompany me?" By the time, I would stay quiet and run to my bed to cry. However, Genevieve's husband came to realize that his wife had probably known his secret relationship with the preacher. He had impregnated her, and the news of the relationship had spread throughout the whole neighborhood. But this didn't bother him a bit, as he doubled down instead, this time providing to both families equally, though his income had not increased. When he knew that I had discovered his relationship with the preacher, he was not shameful or repentful. Instead, he doubled down his aggression. He would buy a sack of rice and ask me to divide it into 2 equal parts, one for us and the other for the preacher. Whatever he ordered me, I would simply comply. As you can imagine, Genevieve's husband started to run out of money, especially that his transport business was no longer lucrative as it used to be. At the same time, Genevieve had had enough and wanted to leave this neighborhood, thinking that it would discourage her husband's relationship with the preacher. Her husband refused, but she insisted. When she was finally packing her materials, she learned that her husband had not actually paid the rent for their house for 9 months, and she only relocated to a new place at the mercy of their landlord. Her husband followed her up and promised that he would never help her financially. A few months later, Genevieve ran out of money and her children struggled to continue their studies. But her misery was just beginning. She later found a job, but her husband came to disrupt it, prompting her boss to sack her. This time, she had run out of options and decided to take her children to the village, where life was cheaper than in the city where she lived. While she was undergoing all this, her husband surprisingly came to ask for forgiveness, and he literally moved in with Genevieve for a month before going back to the preacher. He later came to ask for pardon. He told me that it was over and that it would never happen again. But by the time he came back, our children were no longer able to study. I considered how I knew him before and decided to forgive him. But within a month, he returned back to live together with the preacher. But because he had no money to provide to the preacher's house, they started to treat him badly. Later on, he was ashamed to come back to my house after being chased away by the preacher. He decided to go to Uganda to start another life. In Uganda, her husband struggled to establish himself as his health deteriorated with various complications. Genevieve sent him a child to take care of him in his sickness. Unfortunately, his husband would later die. He started to develop some serious sickness, and he asked me to send him a child who would be with him since his health had deteriorated so much. I sent him a child, and it was the sign that I had fully forgiven him. I used to talk to him and he would tell me how he was doing. In my heart, I had already forgiven him and told him so. He later died in Uganda, but he died after I had forgiven him. After the death of her husband, Genevieve remained with the question of how she would find her child again. But luckily, after the help from the Afrimax community, her child reconciled with her again. What Genevieve has gone through has a huge toll on her current life, especially in regard to how she handles people. I have seen one of the harshest lessons anyone can learn in life. I cannot have a female friend since the one who was my best friend is the one who betrayed me. I always worry about people. Those who come preaching are not always interested in helping us. Genevieve's story is a reflection of life's troubling storms that swings us in the directions we have not longed for, but her insistence to survive is a reflection of the light which is always at the end of the tunnel. Thank you for watching. I'm Elijah and this is Afrimax English. Remember to subscribe.